I see the pace is slowing of folks coming into the room, and we're at a minute afterwards, so I'm going to get us started. Welcome, everyone, to the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's January Science Seminar. My name is Jess Delfiaco. I'm the Communications Manager for the Midwest CASC, as we call it, based here at the University of Minnesota. Thank you so much for spending a little time on your Monday morning/afternoon with us. We are excited to have a great guest speaker today. Before we jump into things, I've got a couple of housekeeping notes. As you've noticed, we are recording this. It'll be posted on our YouTube channel afterwards. So please keep yourself muted during today's presentation. And you can choose whether you'd like to have your video on or not. You're welcome to turn your videos on and go off mute during our Q&A portion at the very end of today's event. But until then, please keep yourself muted. You can put questions in the Q&A function throughout Michael's presentation today, but as I said, please hold any going off mute or asking questions directly until the very end. We will have plenty of time for that. All right, so I see some new faces in the room today, so I'm going to do a quick overview of what the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center is. We're a partnership between the U.S. Geological Survey and a consortium of institutions throughout the Midwest region, which you can see on this slide. And we're hosted here at the University of Minnesota. We're part of a national network of these regional CASCs, all of which work to produce science, which can inform research management and help fish, wildlife, water, land, and people adapt to a changing climate. We accomplish this in several different ways, including conducting synthesis research on topics that are relevant to important priorities for our region. We support a large network of graduate students and postdoctoral fellows at these institutions and on our research projects. We run a tribally focused undergraduate research program in the summers. We host workshops and an annual gathering each year for our community to get together and share research and resources. More on those on my next slide. And then, of course, we fund climate adaptation research projects and partnerships through the USGS. Next, I have just a couple of announcements, which are all upcoming events that we would love to have you all attend and check out. On February 4th, we are going to be hosting the next meeting of the Midwest Climate Adaptation Science Center's Community of Practice. This is a collaborative group that meets periodically to share learning about adaptation science and using Midwest CASC research and resources. If you'd like to join that meeting, please reach out to me or my colleague Alyssa, who you'll see in a moment on this call, and we'll get you hooked up with all the details. Later in February, we're going to be hosting a networking hour, kind of an informal, interactive online meeting for folks who might be interested in proposing a research project, developing a research project with the Midwest CASC in the future. Again, reach out to me via email or pop me out in the chat and we'll get you that invite. You are all welcome to attend. That's specifically targeted for folks at our consortium member institutions. So if you are faculty at any of those institutions that were on the map on that last slide, we encourage you to check that out and join us to learn more. Lastly, our biggest event of the year is our annual gathering. We just announced the date for this year's gathering, which is going to take place at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign from August 5th to the 7th. This is a time for the Midwest CASC community to come together. That includes researchers, students, postdocs, and partners to learn about what we've all been doing, what we've learned, and kind of support existing collaborations and hopefully create new ones as well. We'll be sharing more details on this event in the coming weeks and months. I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter or check back on our website for updates there. Okay, I think that is it from me. I'm gonna go on to the main event here. I'm very happy to welcome Dr. Michael Aiuvalasit to lead today's seminar. Michael is a research scientist at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, which is part of the University of Illinois. I'm sure he'll share much more about his background and expertise in just a moment. But yeah, I wanted to say welcome to Michael. The stage is yours. I will stop sharing my slides and let you take the floor.
Great. Thank you very much, Alyssa. And thanks everyone for attending here today. I really appreciate your participation, which I hope we'll get in a bit. First, I want to make sure play the slide sharing game. Make sure I get the right thing here. Okay, so I'm going to share screen. All right, how does that look?
Looks good.
Great. Well, wonderful. Well, again, thanks everyone for attending today. And as Jess said, I'm a research scientist here at the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, which is one of the 5 scientific surveys that fall under the umbrella of the Prairie Research Institute here at the University of Illinois. Others may be familiar with this organization through our sister surveys, the Geological Survey or the Illinois Natural History Survey. Now, ISAS is one of the largest university-affiliated archaeological research centers in America. We have over 70 employees, and 15 of which have PhDs. So our mission is to study the past of what we now call Illinois, share what we've learned, and work to protect the sites of our shared past into the future. And I must state here that, of course, what we now call Illinois is the traditional territory of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Wea, Neamia, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Nausaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, Menominee, Ho-Chunk, and Chickasaw nations. Now, to provide an outline of today's presentation, I'm first going to speak about what are cultural resources. There's a very broadening of definitions, and considering this organization mostly deals with what we call natural resources, I think it behooves us to spend a little bit of time laying out what cultural resources are and how they're protected in the United States. Next, I'll review the climate report that we have put together here at ISAS, where we examine how soil erosion, flooding, and the potential for demographic shifts may impact the cultural resources of our state. And then I'll conclude with sort of thinking through what solutions we'll need to address the problems, acknowledge the real challenges, and then open things up for discussion for everyone attending. And I would hope that some of my co-authors on this report will also be able to participate as well. But first, I want to do a little survey. Hopefully this will work out. A little audience poll. I'm curious the backgrounds of where people are coming from for this presentation. And there is a very leading question at the end here that speaks to sort of the overall trend. But I think you can click on as many things as you'd like. So we're seeing this poll going here. And yeah, this is not truly, I guess you couldn't say it's a scientific poll when you have this third question. But this is something that I've been impressed with in attending Midwest CAST meetings and attending some of these seminars, is this sort of broadening of perspective that this organization can bring to thinking through climate impacts and climate impacts on, on land, society, and nature. So it looks like we've got a good end to our poll here. That looks like a good mixture of folks from what we both call cultural resources and natural resources, and a lot of folks looking for ways to work together in the future. So I'm excited to kind of get a handle on that. Cool. So to get in, what is a cultural resources? Cultural resources are these tangible places and pieces of history. It's not just what's written in a textbook, but it's physical pieces of the past that you can visit, touch, see, and experience. So we showed you the Lincoln home in the previous slide. These are some examples of Lincoln's photographs of Lincoln's home in Springfield, Illinois. This is the home that the family lived in before heading off to Washington, D.C. Now, anyone can go and make a tour of this home and get a sense, get that experience of what it was like in the 19th century. To the point you could even see Lincoln's desk where he wrote many exemplary pieces of U.S. history at that desk. So these are the kind of things we think of a cultural resource, probably. This too is a home in Illinois, but a home potentially about 500 years before the home that we saw of Abraham Lincoln's. What we're looking at is an aerial view, looking down from using a drone at the outline of a indigenous house located about 20 minutes south of Bloomington Normal. This house was occupied by a family around the year 1300 CE in a small village of about 30 to 40 houses of people who were indigenous peoples living kind of on the edge of the prairie. This house here is surrounded by pits that people would store their food and crops that they would grow, and ultimately would become places for disposal after big feasting events or other day-to-day activities. Now, as archaeologists, we study the material remains of the past to better understand the deep scale of human history. So the artifacts that when you think of as archaeologists studying, come from these types of features. Excavations happened at this site because the site was under threat for development. And so in consultation with descendant tribal nations, we worked out an excavation plans and series of protocols to try to learn from this site. Now, something I want you to notice at this one site is just how shallow it is. You can see the plow scars on the margins of this cultural this house here. Speaking to the vulnerability of these sites relative to the kinds of impacts that they can have. Now, this is just one house, but Illinois in the Midwest is the scene of tremendous historical events that happened in indigenous histories. This is an artist representation of the ancient city of Cahokia. This is in East St. Louis, just across the Mississippi River from St. Louis. And this was the largest indigenous city in North America. Imagine, right, one of those reconstructions, the site I showed with the one little house, this community was made up of thousands of homes, hundreds of large earthen mounds. So that became the center for this true North American city. And it's a place that you can visit today. The largest of the mounds, Monk's Mound, is visible right here. And it's a place that is a World UNESCO Heritage Site, recognized around the world and recognized by descendants of the people who built this city as an incredibly important place. So this too, written across this whole landscape, are what we've come to call cultural resources. There's also a broader conception that we are working with is tribal cultural resources. This has been written into state law in California. Tribal cultural resources, a site feature, a place, a cultural landscape, a sacred place, or an object, which is of cultural value to a tribe. As such, it doesn't have to be just the artifacts or their material remains. It can be things of value writ large. And what we're seeing here in the Midwest is great work by folks like Blithwick to promote and broaden the appreciation about how non-human beings are culturally significant. So the work they're doing with sturgeon, monomen, and other plants and animals is really broadening this perspective for non-tribal folks, certainly, on what is a culturally significant resource. Now, why are cultural resources important? First, people genuinely like history. I've read a report in Bloomberg News recently that of all in the print world, in the publishing world, history books are one of the few growth segments of the market that's growing. Okay. However, cultural resources are incredibly significant for descendant communities, for the peoples whose past it is that's represented in these either material objects and the stories and relationships we have with them. Here in Illinois, it's been considered a removal state because there were no tribes that had lands in Illinois until just this past year, when the Prairie Band Potawatomi were able to get lands, federal recognition for lands in the state. Their relationship to these lands and is directly related to the significance of these histories, and cultural resources are effectively the not just representation, but the evidence of this. We also can't rule out sort of the economic aspect of cultural resources and how some people are consider cultural resources. Our historic downtowns, urban areas. The National Trust for Historic Preservation has a Main Street program that allows the directive of funds to help conserve and rehabilitate cultural resources like historic urban downtowns. The state of Illinois, since 1992, their Illinois Main Street program says over $1.2 billion has been reinvested into communities through these programs, starting over 24,000 businesses and 11,000 jobs in the process of renovating over 1,200 structures. So this too, albeit blatantly capitalistic in a way, is another way that cultural resources are important. So the question is, how do we protect cultural resources in the U.S.? In the U.S., we have a series of laws and regulations, which in the U.S. is a bit different than other countries, because in many other nations, heritage resources are owned by the state, regardless if they're found on public lands or if they're found on private lands. In the U.S., unless there are ordinances, local ordinances or state ordinances related to private lands, people actually on private lands sort of own the cultural resources. Now, in the U.S., we of course have the Antiquities Act of 1906, which gives the president the authority to designate national monuments to protect heritage. In 1966, there was the passage of the National Historic Preservation Act, which created the National Register of Historic Places and the State Historic Preservation Office's systems. This is a list, the Register of Historic Places is a listing of significant places across the country that can be added to, and the State Historic Preservation Office sort of oversees these lists state by state. Now, a key mandate in this act was that federal agencies had to evaluate the impact of all federally funded or permitted projects on historic properties, and potentially assess if there were potentially unknown or undiscovered historic resources that had to be considered when there was some kind of federal undertaking. So it can't just be Lincoln's house. It may be things like undiscovered cultural sites of indigenous communities. It may be things like a site that was listed recently in Illinois, Hispanic laborer camps, the ruins of them, I guess, in Rockford, Illinois. And this has led to a tremendous amount of work documenting these types of sites. That law also produced the Tribal Historic Preservation Offices, which gives tribes authority to oversee the functions of SHPOs on their tribal lands, to represent their interests on project reviews in ancestral lands, and then to implement the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, which facilitates the return of their ancestors and assorted funerary items to the tribal nations. And then finally, of course, we protect cultural resources by communities caring about these resources. In this case, we at ISAS will work with communities, in this case, the community of Brooklyn, Illinois, who one of the earliest or the earliest African-American founded community in the United States, to uncover parts of their past. So how are cultural resources vulnerable to climate change? As natural hazards become more intense and frequent due to climate change, cultural sites are impacted just like other natural and cultural resources. We think of sea level rise eroding shorelines, destroying cultural sites, and destroying the context of these sites. This has led to a lot of research in those types of settings to assess the vulnerabilities of sites and also to protect them. So what about Illinois? All right. We can't understand the scale or scope of any problem until we've found a way to measure it. Now, the Nature Conservancy sponsored a study by scientists to assess the impacts of climate change in Illinois across a wide range of issues: agriculture, water sciences, public health. But they left out cultural heritage. So ISAS had a project going led by John Lambert, and supported by Director Tim Pocketot, to initiate the Illinois Climate Change Modeling Initiative to model the impacts of climate change to cultural resources. Our report is sort of the first compilation of the work we've been doing to start tackling this problem. So what does data look like that goes into this report, and the data we need to get at the questions at hand? There are now, actually, it's over 70,000 previously recorded cultural sites across the state, all those little red dots. At least 56,000 of them are pre-contact sites, and 19,000 are historic sites. We can take this kind of information, as well as other information on amounts of surveys, to develop predictive models to help us find sites. And based on what we found, we can estimate perhaps the number of sites there were before colonization, number of places where Indigenous peoples left traces of their lives behind. We estimate there's potentially over millions of pre-contact sites in Illinois before contact. So the kinds of questions we are getting into: soil erosion integrates a number of different geospatial data sets from across the state. We want to look at the impact of flooding on cultural resources. In that case, the First Street Foundation has produced flooding maps that project how flooding will change across our country. And then we want to look at demography, because development is one of the biggest impacts on cultural resources, and thinking through what demographic forces may happen on our state in the future. So first, let's talk about soil erosion. Soil erosion can be both a fast and a slow process. The formation of gullies through sites immediately and drastically damages and disturbs cultural materials, mixing things apart. Imagine those pits that I showed associated with that ancient house. That pit may represent a series of events in filling it, but if it gets eroded away, all the materials get scattered, they start breaking down, and we can't study it to tell the kind of story about what was happening there. But erosion was also a slow-moving process. This is an agricultural field adjacent to some undisturbed forest land, and we can measure that over time, this field has lost 25 centimeters in depth in soil since the 1890s. So think back to that the site that I showed, and just how shallow the cultural materials were below the plow zone. Sites like that are incredibly vulnerable to loss, just due to even these slow-paced aspects of erosion. So one thing we've been doing at ISAS is monitoring erosion to understand the actual rate of erosions at cultural sites. Remote sensing techniques like LiDAR and photogrammetry are precise enough that we can do flights and revisits and see changes to sites. Our colleague Mike Farkas did this study at Monk's Mound at the site of Cahokia. In the photo I showed, you could see the stairway earlier where we would walk up, and it looks very nice and lovely. But if you looked around the backside of the mounds, you would see that they're suffering significant erosion, significant slumping of soils, where the blue is a loss in elevation over a 2-year period, and the red is the accumulation. So we're getting these lobes of sediment eroding down, which clearly demonstrates these issues. And these issues are only going to become worse with higher intensity, higher magnitude rainfall events. So we started a project where we're visiting different kinds of sites across the state and different kinds of landforms, so we can start taking these year-to-year measurements to kind of get a handle on what this process looks like. But how do we approach this at the state level? We've employed the revised universal soil loss equation, the Russell equation, which is something soil scientists and agronomists use to measure the loss of soil across entire landscapes. The ultimate metric is the soil loss in tons per hectare per year. So we compiled these data sets from across the state because the landscape is more variable than people give it credit for, and the land cover and land uses also vary considerably. So this allowed us to develop an index of erosion potential for across the state and identify some interesting trends. First, we were able to identify vulnerable areas in the darker orange and reddish colors, which do correlate to steeper lands and farmed terrains across the state. Now, in terms of erosion potential, when we look at where the overlay the distribution of cultural sites, 80% of pre-contact sites fall within these high erosion areas, while 82% of historic sites fall within these areas. And so I believe I said part of our work is to develop models of where sites may be located, and 51% of the high probability areas in our models are also vulnerable to erosion. So this model doesn't necessarily look forward to future impacts. So what we hope to be able to do in the future with this sort of model is to adjust some of the variables to reflect future change. So for example, increased severe precipitation is one of the anticipated effects of climate change. And just with 2% warming, we're expecting to see a 15 to 29% increase in severe precipitation events, and up to 38 to 65% of an increase under 3% warming. So we can ideally use that kind of data to start making projections either in very specific areas or again across the whole state. Next issue is flooding. Illinois is a very flood-prone state. We're surrounded by water, like Michigan, the Mississippi River, the Ohio River, the Wabash. They make up most of our boundaries. Are sort of hemmed in by water. 15% of the state by area is within a floodplain. And within that, there are 250,000 structures in these floodplains. And when it comes to disasters in the state, most of the time they're due to floods. 90% of the declared disasters in Illinois are due to floods. So when we wanted to think about flooding, we wanted to think about the impacts to historic resources. So we worked with Michael Smith, our historics and architecture history section lead, to work through integrating the modeling of flooding risks to the types of to historic resources. And as you can see, these floodings happen all over the state. They can happen to really historically significant places. And I must also acknowledge, the mighty, I think we have 60 miles of coastline along Lake Michigan, also has its own issues with flooding along the lakeshore. But those aren't accommodated in this model. So just turning to the historic sites. There are over 2,000 registered or potentially eligible structures listed on the National Register of Historic Places here in Illinois. So we took that as our data set, and then we used this flood data from the First Street Foundation, which is the organization that they now do mostly work with insurance companies. They're also involved with Zillow, and they provide this kind of information about some of the risks based on different hazards. And so they have projections looking in the past, the present, and the future of what we can anticipate with flooding. And there's some nice things about their model. One, it's not the FEMA models typically only include overbank flooding, but these models also can include surface runoff, which makes them a little more powerful in urban settings. And you can also map out by the predicted flood depth. And we looked at flood depths of 1 foot and up to 4 foot across the range of different sort of projections of annual hazards. This is important because at 1 foot is when Army Corps of Engineers studies have shown you start seeing significant impact to historic structures of the 1 foot flooding depth. So I hate to show you charts, but you're gonna get 2 slides worth of charts. So in our analysis, we found that the magnitude of flooding correlates to the number of sites or structures affected. That should be no surprise. In blue, a 5-year flood gives you a pretty small number of structures. The 500-year flood gives you many, many structures. But these lines aren't particularly interesting in figure A here. We find that future climate change does not significantly increase the number of sites that are at risk to damaging floods. However, when we drill in, we do see some differences from the types of historic structures. So for example, this figure B here are historic districts listed in the National Register of Historic Places or certified local governments. And in this case, we see that districts are pretty resilient, don't have much effects, just regular annual floods. However, they can be subject, many of them are, and in fact, more than most, are affected by much larger floods. And again, for a historic district, this is just if the flood touches a district, so it's not that the whole district gets inundated. However, as historic districts are usually made up of the houses listed on registers or other properties that are not listed, it does speak to the vulnerability of the kinds of communities that have been recognized as being historically significant. Interestingly, when we look at the distinction between structures that are already on this list of registered historic places versus ones that are potentially eligible, we do see significant difference. Sites that are already listed are far less vulnerable to flooding than ones that have yet to be listed, which speaks to potentially how communities have already built out some protection for their historic structures, just the survivorship bias, perhaps, of structures that are already listed. But it raises the question about the vulnerability of things that could be listed. Another interesting thing we found in this was comparing urban versus rural listed and eligible sites. Urban sites, regardless of the size of the flood, are far less vulnerable than rural sites. So we really have to think through then, when we're thinking about protection, what aspect of history may be vulnerable here, and it looks like in these rural settings. So for future work on flooding, while we may not see more structures being impacted by flooding in the future, the structures that are being impacted may be hit harder. When we drilled into the average flood depths of the floods, we said, well, the 1 foot is our threshold, but what's the average depths that structures are being flooded at? And the average we found would be 4 feet with a median depth of 2.7 feet. Now, a 1 foot flood can cause damage of 16% to a building's value, but a 4 foot flood can cause up to 30%, not more, leading to significantly different, significantly greater damages. And then with the increased frequency of these floods, we run the risk of saying, well, more sites may not be at risk. The sites that we do have are significantly more at risk. And of course, while we maybe didn't see this looking at the state level, if we drill in and perhaps look at community by community, we may see that some communities do have more sites at risk with flooding in the future. So finally, let's turn to demographics. All right, migration is a response to climate change, and we can see this process happen in the past, and we certainly are expecting this to happen in the future. Some people have projected that hundreds of millions of people worldwide will move within their own countries by 2050 because of slow onset climate impacts. So Illinois isn't that bad when it comes to just in the Midwest in general, the significance of these impacts to society writ large. So if that's the case, we may expect demographic changes where people will be coming to this state, which can then lead to new development. And development is, as we know, is the conversion of land from natural, semi-natural, agricultural state to one that's useful for housing, business, or infrastructure. Which then, of course, leads to the questions, how will this impact cultural resources? Now, one of our archaeologists, Andy White, who thinks a lot about demography in deep time, kind of turned onto this question about looking at how do we look at demography in the future. So being historically minded folks, we looked first to the past to see just how much has historical development potentially impacted cultural resources. So the state of Illinois' population nearly doubled from 6.7 million people in 1920 to 12.8 million people in 2020, a growth rate of about 0.66%. We lost 5 million acres of farmland in that time. And you can look at these historical maps and just see the spread of cities, as we all know, occurs. So we combine this information with data from systematic archaeological surveys to make a rough estimate of the number of sites that were affected by development over this past century. And based on the density of sites recorded, we estimate the growth of cities over the past 100 years has affected 5 to 15% of all pre-contact sites in the state. But how will this growth affect cultural sites in the future? Population growth in Illinois will encourage the expansion of cities and towns that will require this new infrastructure and new development. So we developed a regression formula to express the relationship between population size and the number of acres per person in the state of Illinois, which of course confirmed the longstanding observation that the larger the population of a city, the higher density of occupation. Okay. But then we can use this regression formula as a variable in a GIS model to model the spatial extent for how towns and cities may grow over the next 80 years. So we use different scenarios of growth and also limitations, like you can't grow a city into a river or into a state park or something. And we projected this model under 5% growth, 1% growth, or 1.5% growth. And we applied this to all 1,466 municipalities in the state. So what do we find? Under this 1% growth scenario, we have 1.6 million acres of new development in the state, which would affect up to 55,000 pre-contact sites, 57,000 of which we've documented, and then based on our modeling, another 49,000 which we haven't. And then there's some interesting things to consider here. Some of this would happen, of course, inside the expansion of municipal areas, but we'd also have to factor in other infrastructures that have to be accommodated as well. So we're talking about basically having as many, we have about 70,000 recorded sites right now. A 1% annual growth rate could lead to the potential loss of as many sites that we've discovered already through over the last 100+ years of research. Another challenge with working with demography in this, as I said early at the beginning, is that most if it's private development, they don't have to necessarily go through all these surveys. Maybe if they're getting a permit for some new water lines, the transmission lines that have to go into a community, the new roads perhaps, not necessarily for those new subdivisions. And that creates a big challenge on how we're going to approach dealing with development. Another issue is historic housing is quite often affordable housing. Historic housing in our cities and houses that are historically significant so sometimes get tax breaks to be developed or redeveloped. And quite often those are tied to housing affordability, making housing that is affordable. Pressures to increase supply of housing often leads to demolishing older buildings, which then of course makes building opportunities for new buildings, but quite often more expensive buildings. So to summarize again here, our results. 80 to 82% of the known cultural sites in Illinois are vulnerable to soil erosion. While the spatial extent of flooding won't impact more sites than it has, we expect the sites that are there to experience more damage. And then, as I said just briefly, new development may impact more sites that we've been able to document over the last 100 years. Now, I want to state that this is just version 1.0 of this study. There are other factors that we don't consider, the changes of potential for fire in the Midwest. Here in Illinois, at least, it's not considered much of a hazard, but changes in land cover and frequencies of droughts may lead to fire becoming an issue. Another issue is climate change's impact on historic buildings. More rapid temperature fluctuations can lead to damage to architectural elements. So what needs to be done? I put this slide together, and of course, we have a list of things we can try to tackle with this stuff, but I think we all have to kind of pull back and just sort of digest the implications of all this. I think I work a bit with conservationists, but I think we also share the same feeling, and there's this sense of loss that permeates this work, and we have to find this drive in ourselves to keep going, to protect what we can and do the work that we can in face of all these big challenges. So of course, I think what we need, of course, are big philosophical changes in how we view the past, how we protect our, how we think about cities, and how we think about development patterns. But I wanted to speak to something because just last night we had, I put this slide together before, of course, and I'll go through it. But yesterday here at the U of I, we had a wonderful performance that brought together Robin Wall Kimmerer and a composer who wrote a piece that took her words and put it to a choral work and a string quartet. And the title of the piece was Singing Land. And this was world premiered last night. And, it was really affecting to see this work and to think about the implications of this work. So I want to share the last stanza from this piece. And this piece was looking at the effects of where we are in humanity's relationship to Earth. And it was, what will it be like on that golden morning when we understand what we could be? People singing their thanks to the land, and the land singing thanks back to them. That is the song that could save us. Maybe too late, or maybe just in time. Let us weep for the world we have broken apart and love her back to wholeness. So I thought that affecting love her back to wholeness is, at least in our professional capacities, what we try to do in some ways to think about the effects of climate change and other pressures to the earth and its resources, to these sites that are effectively the gifts of people from the past that have been passed down to us. What are we going to do with them? So first, I want to say we've got to identify these win-wins for protecting cultural and natural resources. And there was a great example up in Joe Daviess County where their Conservation Foundation and the Archaeological Conservancy worked together to purchase property that could then be protected in perpetuity, that both had rich ecological value, and also significant cultural sites on it. Two, we need to better integrate the significance of cultural resources into community hazard management plans. As communities across the nation face hazards, getting the value of these cultural resources into them so that they're being considered, I think is really critical. And we also need to, of course, mobilize to document vulnerable resources and targeted stabilization. Some themes within cultural resources is to ask ourselves, what can we do when we cannot protect them all? And documentation is key. So what are examples of how what people are doing to protect cultural resource? There's been some work in Iowa where they've tried to get ahead of flooding and erosion by rip-wrapping and armoring banks of rivers that have sites right along them that also have the potential to affect highways and other infrastructure. So recognizing that the cultural site is also vulnerable, and they need to protect that as well, is one example. Two is eliciting citizen science and getting communities involved to document sites that are vulnerable and at risk. And there's some great examples of work that's being done in the coastal settings. In Long Island, there's work by Indigenous communities to buffer the risks of loss by protecting and extending shorelines, creating these enriching environments by creating back channel areas and such that are good for the ecosystems, but they also protect cultural resources as well. Yet some communities on Long Island and other places in the Northeast are doing things where they go out and they identify what aspects of their community that are at risk for loss that are really, really valuable to them, documenting those historic places, and then incorporating their elements and designs into new rebuilds in safer places. So CASC is a vehicle for protecting cultural resources and a vehicle for taking a broader perspective on how we protect these resources. These are just some of the examples by going through the Project Explorer of some of the other projects that have happened in some of the other CASC regions, mostly in the Southeast and the South Central. So there's great examples that we have of this kind of work. So to conclude, I want to recognize that this is a work by multiple folks who are involved in this study, and colleagues across the Illinois State Archaeological Survey, some hydrologists and others. We want to, of course, say that this is just version 1 of this study, and we welcome the involvement of more folks who have interest in future versions. Of course, the Prairie Research Institute is a great place to do this kind of work because we have hydrologists, geologists, and ecologists to talk to and work with these things. And also must acknowledge the Archaeological Conservancy, who was involved in this and took great interest. They go out and preserve and protect sites all across the country. So with that, I want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to having a discussion here and taking your questions.
Thank you so much, Michael, for your presentation. Really fascinating work presented from your report. Appreciate that. Jess, thanks for popping the link to the report in the chat. So if folks haven't already had a chance to review it, they have that link there. Michael, a few questions have come in. If you're willing to take a look at those with me. There's one in the chat here that said, during your presentation, you mentioned a company that provides flooding maps that had greater detail than perhaps FEMA's. Was that because of watershed areas were included? Could you provide a little bit more information on that, please?
Sure. Well, that is they're called the First Street Foundation. And in terms of, show the watershed areas as well. Yeah, so it shows more than FEMA's. For what I understand, a lot of the maps that some of my colleagues in the Water Survey produce for the state of Illinois is quite often they're built out community by community or county by county. And in the case of the First Street Foundation, I believe their map is nationwide and applies sort of some of the same variables. And I know that those water maps do have to meet FEMA guidelines, but because they're made a little bit differently, they can accommodate some aspects that the FEMA maps don't. And this is, as you can tell by my answer, this is where I betray that I'm not the absolute specialist in this work. Yeah.
Thank you. It looks like a subsequent question came in just now in that chat too about inspecting those First Street maps for artifacts, and perhaps you might reference that question over to First Street Foundation for a little bit more information, or do you have?
Yeah, so yeah, for the accuracy, so artifacts in how the map is constructed, rather than the artifacts that when you think of archaeologists, we talk about the material stuff we find. I am not sure on that. I can't answer that, I'm afraid. Sorry.
No problem. All right. There's another question here in the chat. How do we get people to recognize that cultural resources are not just in the past, but also in the present?
Yeah, great question. I think, for one, so many people's perspective of history is quite shallow, and they don't have these kinds of deep connections to the past. People do, but we need more of that. So one of the challenges as for folks who think about deep time is making sure that these perspectives are being shared. It's amazing to think that some of these sites, if you think of the human life, I could say 10,000 years ago, well, what does that mean? 10 to 12,000 years ago is 250 generations. Okay, and we can find the materials left behind. Arrowheads, stone tools, other things from those time periods all across the state. And if we don't know what we're looking at, they can be lost. So on our end, it's sharing this information to get it out there to people, because these things we're finding are this tangible connection to the past.
I'm going to stay on that topic for just a moment here and grab another question that came in. You talked a little bit about demographic changes, climate migrations in your presentation. When we think about climate change, there's a lot of focus on the emergence of unprecedented or novel conditions. But in your report, You talk about the opportunity to learn from past changes in climate. Can you talk a little bit more perhaps about how this may help us adapt to those future climatic changes?
Yeah, so in our report, which I thank you all for putting the hyperlink, we have a whole section that speaks to some of the lessons from the past in regards to climate change. And one is that we see people having a degree of mobility that that served them well when resource availability from one place to the next is potentially impacted by climate change. We see some aspects of, you may even call it managed retreat, in over time periods, people making sound decisions about where to put communities relative to resource availability that's affected by climate change. There were some periods around 5,000 years ago, 7 to 4,000 years ago, when climate was in the Midwest was drier and warmer than it is today. And we see that affected in the distribution of where people move on a landscape. We also see, when we look at places like Cahokia, that resource availability may have been impacted by droughts that may have affected agricultural production. So we look at these interplays between food production and the complexity of urban living, setting up some vulnerabilities that we potentially can think through today when we talk about, at least in Southern Illinois, issues of flash droughts, rapid onset droughts that can really quickly impact agricultural production. We can sort of think through some of these scenarios by looking at the deep time record that we have here in Illinois.
Great, thank you. I've got another question teed up here that maybe follows that question well here. Is there, and I had the same question as I was listening to your presentation as you were showing the vulnerability maps of some of the sites and talking about how 80%, I think it was, upwards of 80% of some of those sites were vulnerable. The question says, are there any data suggesting that remaining pre-contact sites are located in areas especially vulnerable to climate change, in part because those areas were less attractive for post-settlement agriculture or development? Is that something your report looked into?
Well, I mean, I flip it around a little bit, is that from a historical perspective, so many of our cities, the foundations of these cities are on Indigenous paths. And so as cities have grown, they have sort of, impacted a lot of cultural sites then and there. Now, but that raises a good question, sort of the types of impacts. If you have areas that are more marginal today, might those have been marginal in the past to an extent? It can be highly variable to that extent. There are parts of Western Illinois that have remarkable archaeological record of these cultural sites going back thousands and thousands of years. We might consider them economically marginal today, but at first blush, I would say that it's more a function of the differences in economy and scale and what we value today than what those places have to offer.
Thank you. All right, I see one more question here in the chat. Do you see the question from Marcy? It says, you mentioned all of the, okay, you got it there? Yes. All the disciplines, I'll voice it here for folks listening. You mentioned all the disciplines at the Prairie Research Institute. Are these disciplines at PRI interested in and planning to use this report in their work? Will it extend beyond the ISIS?
Yeah, thank you, Marcy. Yes. Although sometimes there's more challenges to develop these collaborations than you think. But no, for one, with the flooding hazard maps, we have our water survey produces the kinds of data that communities can use to assess flood vulnerabilities. when we worked through this, we realized, hey, it's not going to be that hard to get a layer of some of the cultural sites into their flooding maps. The layers that can be publicly released at least. So that then communities could say, in addition to the areas of their town that might be affected, which historical sites may be vulnerable as well. That's an example. This kind of work has played in a little bit with our, broadly speaking, with some of our conservationists to try to start thinking through, like, where can we find places on landscapes that have both this cultural and natural value. A project I'm involved with a little bit is one of the task-funded projects that's starting off on identifying climate refugia. Might there be an overlap between places that on the landscape that will be resilient to climate change, that will facilitate resilient ecosystems, and the locations of places that have been culturally significant for thousands of years here in Illinois. And so for that project, we're looking to kind of explore if this kind of data set is a way to help identify places like that Joe Davies Archaeological Conservancy project where we can find these win-win settlements. Those are two examples of some overlap.
Excellent. It looks like the last two questions are somewhat similar in nature about the coordination of work across states.
Yeah, so this work has been happening the kind of modeling work has been happening in southeastern states, in states affected by hurricanes, actually. There's federal disaster funding that can go after disaster declaration to funding historical preservation work. People have identified that the regulatory process of rebuilding, will trigger, because there's federal money involved, these reviews as to impacts to cultural resources. And so these predictive models are helping state agencies to work through how to assess impacts. However, like too often, you need to have the funding from the disaster to fund the work. So here in the Midwest, there really hasn't been these kinds of studies, but we're looking to expand this. And at our regional archaeology meeting we had last fall, we brought together a team of agency archaeologists as well as researchers to start kind of thinking through, how we can do this kind of work here in the Midwest.
The irony that the work is driven by disasters. Yes. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you so much. I will turn it back over to Jess to close us out here. But thank you, Michael, for your presentation today. Jess, want to wrap us up?
Yeah. Thank you all so much for spending time with us. Thank you, Michael, for a really fascinating presentation. I'm going to launch a quick poll, which we'd really appreciate you all filling out before you hop off. I also put the link in the chat if you're interested in our work. And if you liked this seminar, I invite you to join us for the other seminars in our winter series. They're always on the fourth Monday of the month. You can register there. Again, thank you all. Really happy to have you and enjoy the rest of your Monday.
And Michael, if you're still there, thanks again so much. Appreciate your time.
You're welcome, Melissa. Thank you. Thank you,
Hope to see you in August.
Jess.